Well, good morning to all of you joining us. Thanks so much for being here. We've got a number of people who are filling into the webinar, so we'll take just a moment here and allow people to join. But thanks so much for everybody spending part of their time with us this morning, this afternoon and evening. It looks like we've got folks from all over the world joining today, so really nice to see all these familiar names. Um, Obviously this has been another interesting year in terms of college admissions. And so we're happy to sort of give you our perspective on what we've seen and also, sort of provide some guidance on, kind of what next steps can be and how you should start thinking about the process. So we'll jump right in and hopefully this won't take longer than about 25 minutes. We've seen the continued trend over the last 5 or 6 cycles in terms of more applications. Students are applying to more schools. Students are utilizing technology through the Common App and similar aggregators in terms of applying to more schools. So we saw this past year more applications than ever before, and that's really across the board, which makes it a very difficult task for admissions officers to facilitate the application process, because in many cases, these admissions offices just simply don't have the resources to appropriately review all applications. They do their best. They certainly make use with the resources they have available, but as you'll see here shortly, when you see schools like UCLA reaching 150,000 applications in one cycle, it's incredibly difficult. The second thing that we saw, which has again continued the trend, is a greater use of wait lists. And essentially what schools are doing are squeezing the number of kids that they admit in the regular round and taking on these very large wait lists in an effort to, sort of measure and form their freshman class. And so they're able to admit fewer kids, make sure that their yield hits what they want it to, and then slowly but surely bring kids off the wait list. And we'll talk a little bit about the strategy on how to navigate the wait list and what the expectation is. But we're seeing more and more students receiving waitlist notifications versus a straight rejection or obviously an acceptance. Test optional, test blind continues to be a significant part of this process. And, I think what's important to understand is that test optional is very good for the universities. And so it's our opinion that test optional for the most part is here to stay. Obviously you've seen some schools recently in the news come out and saying that they will go back to requiring SAT, ACT, obviously MIT, the most recent to do that. And we think that there will be a handful of schools that will do that. But for the larger sort of, 4,000 four-year universities in the United States, test optional is most likely here to stay. Test blind, you've obviously have seen the news that the UC and the CSU here in California will continue to not require and not allow the submission of test scores. And I think as I'll show you here shortly, for California residents, that's probably bad news. It will lead to even more applications than we saw this year. And, we'll see the reduction of admit rates at the UCs and the CSUs. And the bit of good news that we are seeing is that kids who applied early decision specifically, as well as early action, are seeing a greater statistical chance of getting in. So kids who are able to, be prepared, be ready, and submit in the early round are seeing a benefit there. And that trend seems to be continuing and seems to be continuing in a significant way. So this will sort of give you guys a perspective on just the volume of applications that these universities are getting. When you look at a school like NYU, it's first time ever, over 100,000 applications. Northeastern in Boston, 10 years ago, Northeastern wasn't on the radar for most families. Now it's become an incredibly popular destination, and you can see that just by the number of kids applying. You see USC with 69,000 kids, and even if you look down at the lowest one on this list, Middlebury, which is in Vermont, which is an unbelievable school academically. You say, oh gosh, 13,000 kids. That's not that's actually, in comparison to UCLA, that's actually pretty doable. But you got to remember, a school like Middlebury that only has a couple thousand kids, they're only admitting hundreds of kids. So their admit rate remains really, really competitive. So, let's talk about, the good news part of this first. There are great schools in the United States. There's nearly 4,000, four-year universities. And many of them have, very healthy acceptance rates. University of Oregon, one of the strongest business programs on the West Coast. You have Auburn University, University of Arizona, which we've referenced in prior webinars, has, essentially what is the industry leading, program for kids who have learning differences called SALT. Is essentially the DNA that every university has tried to copy. And Boulder, one of the top business engineering destinations now for kids. It is an unbelievable school, and still accepting 84% of their applications, of their students. So, there are really, really good choices. But a lot of our families, and understandably so, are looking for slightly more competitive universities. This sort of gives you a perspective of the second tier. And, you start to look at these applications, and you start to look at these universities, and you get an understanding of why you're seeing so many rejections and so many waitlists. I mean, Georgetown dropping to 12%, Northwestern at 7%, Rice at 9%. I mean, that's incredibly low admissions rates. And these are not what we would call the super selective universities. I mean, even Pepperdine, 30% this year. It's their lowest admit rate ever. People wanting to be at a university near the beach, wanting to be in Southern California, wanting to have a great business degree, and be in a wonderful campus setting, drove applications up this year. And that's, that is certainly a far cry from the 60 or 70% admit rate that Pepperdine had, say, 10 years ago. So I think one thing that we have been able to pick up this year has really been this notion of in-state and out-of-state acceptance rates, and whether these schools really make sense to apply to. Let's say if you're from California, and so if you look at the University of Virginia, for example, the in-state acceptance rate is nearly 30%, 28%. At Georgia Tech, it's 35%. And at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, it's 42%. But when you look at the out-of-state acceptance rates, 13%, 15%, 10%, you almost have to ask yourself, is that a reality? And for the example, like with the University of Virginia, that offers both early action, which is non-binding, and early decision, which is binding, you really have to ask yourself, if I'm not applying early decision to the University of Virginia as an out-of-state applicant, California, New York, Florida, is it even worth doing the work? Because the admit rate is just so competitive for kids who are out of state and who are especially not applying early decision. And so, I think that's something that, as people next year start to shape their lists and start to think about universities that are important to them, I think what you're going to see is students dropping these schools from their lists, unless they are places that they really, really are tuned into and want to attend. And so we see this as sort of a continuing trend that, schools are going to continue, especially public institutions, are going to continue to utilize their in-state, acceptance rates, and be very selective for the out-of-state students who are paying more tuition. In some cases, you're seeing, like for the UC system has continually increased the number of out-of-state students, that they take on. We're not seeing that trend in as greater numbers in other states. So the other states seem to be taking care of their kids in state with pretty healthy acceptance rates. and then taking a select few out-of-staters, and you can see this from the data here. So now you start to get into the super elite category, and you look at a place like Penn with 4% acceptance rate, Columbia 4%, Duke 6%. I think what you've got to understand here is, so if we were just to kind of peel the 4% back at Penn, it is likely that a percent would be legacy, a percent would be athletes, and a percent would be sort of institutional priorities. So if you assume that 3% is already sort of spoken for, between legacy athletes and special university commitments, the effective rate of a school like Penn is 1%. And so then again, it goes back to this notion that if you're not applying early decision, do you realistically have a shot, and how are you sort of mitigating that risk over your list? And I think that's the big focus for juniors going into the fall, is really thinking hard about how you shape the overall list or the scenario or scenarios of your college applications. And I think that's something that we're going to be spending a lot of time with our students on, over the next 4 or 5 months, because I think this sort of traditional notion of I'm going to apply to 10 schools, I'm going to apply to 9 schools, I'm going to apply to 15 schools, I think the number almost now is becoming irrelevant. It's really starting to bracket the schools in terms of, where do we think we can get in? Where do we think we're going to be competitive? And how am I maximizing my early decision 1, my early decision 2, and sort of mitigating the risk over the course of the application process. The good news is that, at least what we saw this year with our seniors, students who did do that successfully were really happy with the choices they got. So this isn't all bad news. This is sort of, a continuation of what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 cycles. It's, more applications, continues to be very competitive for students who are applying to selective universities, and really the greater importance and focus on applying early decision, not to a super reach, right? The idea behind early decision isn't to go for the gold. It's about finding a realistic choice. Where is a place where the numbers and the school acceptance from your high school sort of align? Hey, it makes sense for me to apply early decision to X. It makes sense for me to apply, early decision to Y. If I'm a B student with a, 1200 on the SAT, it doesn't make sense for me to apply early decision to Columbia. That's a very, very low chance of success. And this is a slide that we've talked about in the past. This really, I think, will solidify the strategy for most folks. Applying early decision for qualified candidates is the best chance of getting in. And you see that here, right? 15% at Brown, 16% at Penn, 17% at Notre Dame, 21% at Duke, 24% at Vanderbilt. That was one actually a little bit number. It was a number a little bit higher than it's been over the last few years. So clearly what universities are saying is we are incredibly focused on the early decision round. We're thinking through that in a very thoughtful way. And we are looking to identify as many qualified candidates for our university in the early round. And, I think that's not going to change. And so we really have to be thinking and shaping the conversation for our students in terms of, can we find an early decision school that student would be excited about? And we think that is a realistic choice. If you look over the last handful of years, the trend again is that more and more kids are applying early. And this just gives you an example of University of Washington, UPenn, and or WashU, Penn, and Brown. And again, it isn't this upward right trajectory, like a hockey stick. But, you know, if you look at the trend lines, and even if we went back further, I think you'd see it, the graph sort of exacerbated. More and more kids are realizing that early is a successful strategy. And so you are seeing at some of these really competitive schools that they're seeing more early decision applications. They're seeing more early action applications. Kids are getting into the pool early, and it is still continuing to be a beneficial strategy. Again, there's actually a lot of good news here. Our concern going into sort of this COVID cycle the last couple of years was that these very competitive universities were going to take an increasingly larger percentage of their freshman class, in early decision. And the bad news is we haven't really seen that number change that much. Penn still filled 50% of its class. BU filled 50% of its class. Middlebury filled a quarter of the class in this year's early round. But it isn't the 60 or 70% that we thought it was going to be. And even in the case of Duke, that number's actually receded a bit. They only filled 28% of that class this year. It was a bigger number last year, and it was a bigger number the year before. So that is good news that, yes, they are taking a higher percentage of kids, but they're not totally filling that class to a point where regular just becomes, almost totally untenable. So these numbers, for the most part, have held steady for the last couple of years, and in some instances have backed off a little bit. So that's really good news, because what that essentially says is you do have the ability to apply early decision. If you don't get in, you still have the opportunity to apply early decision 2 on January 1st, and you still have the opportunity to roll the dice on a broader level to more schools in the regular decision process. So that is good news for applicants. That's good news for students across the board. And it gives more optionality if you're not accepted to an early decision school. I'm not going to run through all the application types. We will provide the deck to you guys, and so you're happy to take a look at that, and happy to always address any of the specific slides if you have questions. But I do want to go over just sort of the types of admissions deadlines, because this continues to be a confusing piece for a lot of folks. And obviously the colleges aren't helping matters by continually adding new types of applications. So rolling decision is typically what you see at large public institutions. Not all of them have it, but some do. University of Arizona is an example. Arizona State is an example, where basically you can apply, really anytime starting in the summer, and they just will accept kids as they receive applications. And so for schools like that, it is really beneficial if you can submit your application in August, September, October, or early November. And then generally will turn around an admissions decision in 6 to 8 weeks. University of Alabama is notorious for turning around their admissions decisions in about 10 days. Early action is non-binding. Generally, the application deadline is around November 1st, and you will get a decision by December 15th in most cases, not all cases, but most. And this is beneficial for students who have identified schools that they like, that they think are good fits, that they are interested in, but that are not schools that either offer early decision or that student is not willing to commit to a binding program. And I sort of think of the early actions as the why nots. Like, why not apply to Wisconsin? Why not apply to Indiana? Why not apply to SMU? They're really good schools, and it's nice to get yeses, especially early in the process, to build confidence. Restrictive early action essentially is available at 4 schools. There's others that have added similar programs, but in a true nature, restrictive early action is really at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford. And this is the deadly one. This is the one, and folks who've been on these webinars before have heard me sort of lament about this, but this is tough because essentially what it says is if you applied early restrictive early action to Stanford, for example, then you can only apply to out-of-state public universities. So, in theory, you could apply to Stanford and then Michigan, Virginia, Arizona, just as an example. And so for most kids applying to that tier of school, those out-of-state public schools really aren't schools they're thinking about. And as we've seen, the competitiveness of getting into out-of-state public schools has become greater. So, there's certainly no guarantee that the student will be admitted to, either a Virginia or a Michigan, for example. So you really have to ask yourself, why am I applying restrictive early action to one of these 4 schools? Do I have a really compelling chance of getting in? And, am I prepared to go early decision too if I'm not accepted to my restrictive early action choice? Early decision, you can pick one school. It is binding. If you're accepted, you have to enroll. People always ask, is there a way out of that? And can you, sort of finagle a way to decline the offer? And the answer is yes. There are ways around that, specifically around financial aid. But, I tell most people, listen, you don't want to go through that process. If you're applying early decision, you are committed to that university should they accept your son or daughter. You are prepared to pay full retail for the tuition. And, everybody should be thrilled when their student gets accepted early decision. So early decision is not something you want to go down the path of unless you are 100% committed to that particular university. Early decision is essentially just a later version of early decision one. And so it's due January 1st. You find out by February, March. And this is becoming more and more appealing. The challenge is that the list of early decision to, schools isn't huge. You're talking about, Emory, Wash U, Tufts, and other similar schools. So it's not as widely utilized across the universities. And then obviously regular decision due January 1st and by end of March, early April, you've heard. So I just want to talk just a little bit more, about sort of creating this list. This, I think, is going to be imperative for the next round. We have this notion of safety schools, and the way we look at that is like, hey, we are very, very certain that student X is going to be admitted to that university. Every family has the right number. Some kids that's 3, some it's 2, some it's 1. I don't think you need 10 safeties, but I think you need a number that everybody in the family feels like, hey, it's nice to get early yeses. We feel happy with those choices. These are not our top choices, but we feel good that we're building a foundation moving forward. Target, these are schools that, again, utilizing early action can be, really, really helpful. And, I'm seeing most kids applying to, 6 to 7 target schools. Again, depends on the student, depends on the type of school, depends on the round in which they are applying. But this is an area where you want to invest a lot of time and thought in terms of the types of schools and programs in which your son or daughter is interested in. And we're certainly happy to give our opinion on what we think are targets, but this is really an area where you don't want to under apply. You would rather over apply in most cases. And when you look at reaches, I find it very hard, having done this now for 15 years, to tell kids, especially those who have worked incredibly hard, that they shouldn't go for it. The last thing we want is our kids to settle. I think as a parent, I find myself in the same boat as most of you folks, is that, you want what's best for your kid, and you want them to go for it. And going for it is a very valuable life experience and life lesson. But specifically when you're looking at reaches, you can't apply to all Ivy Leagues, and it doesn't matter how good the student is. The student could be incredible, but that's simply just not a strategy that is tenable anymore. And so there has to be sort of this thought process of like, okay, if I'm going to apply early decision to Columbia, I know that's really an incredibly hard school to get into. It's very difficult, but I have mitigated, the risk of not getting in by, having enough target schools and enough safety schools. And by the way, if I don't get in to Columbia early decision, I'm fully prepared to go early decision 2 at Emory. And those are successful strategies in terms of, building a list that will maximize optionality, that will maximize choice, and essentially give, your son or daughter the opportunity. So what do I think is going to happen for the next round? I think you're going to see kids apply to a few more schools. I think you're going to see kids applying to more early action schools. And I think you're going to see more kids applying to early decision schools. And for the kids who are willing to commit to early decision, I think you're going to see the benefit of that if the student is qualified. So I just want to talk now specifically about the UC system because there's been just so much noise in in the news lately, and I think that's something that we really need to discuss. And obviously, there's a lot of families here that are not based in California who have joined the call. But I think it is an interesting perspective because, essentially what you have in the UC system is the, most competitive public institution in the world, right? So some of the top colleges, UCLA was the most applied to school in the world this year. And what you have seen, despite budget cuts, despite, reduction of student services, you've continued to see the growth in the number of applications at the UC system. UCLA had 111 in 2020, then 139, and now 149. And, it says something even when you look at a school like UC Merced, which most of you have probably never heard about. UC Merced is growing applications. UC Riverside is growing applications. I mean, UC Davis, which, for many years was an ag school, which is an unbelievable school, almost had 100,000 applications at 94,000. So, so what does this tell us? For California students, the UC system effectively is a lottery. Okay, it does not matter if you have all A's. It does not matter if you go to the best schools. It does not matter. They don't look at test scores. So obviously your test scores are from an SAT, ACT perspective are somewhat irrelevant. But none of that really matters because there's just such a volume of students applying that it really is a lottery, really is sort of like a guessing game. And so, our advice on kids who insist on applying to the UC system, number one is, assume that if you apply to all of them, assume that the majority of the responses statistically will be either rejections or wait lists. And two, do not hyper focus on, the major. For example, if you're applying to UC Berkeley, applying UC Berkeley engineering is even more competitive in this process. And if you really, really want to go to Berkeley, you might consider looking at a major where, the acceptance rate is a little bit more in line with the overall university acceptance rate. And so looking at impacted majors, which generally are STEM related, it's very difficult at places like, a Berkeley or even a Davis. I mean, engineering at Davis is really competitive. So we have to use the UC system as a supplement. It's fine to apply. There's no downside to apply. They do not have early decision. They do not have early action. They have one filing period. At roughly $25,000, $26,000 a year for in-state students, it still represents a tremendous cost savings versus private, universities. But the reality is that there's just not enough seats to go around, and that most students who apply to the UC system will not find a place. And so it's fine to apply. It's fine to give it a shot, but really having to be realistic with, with the chances now, just given the number of kids applying in the system. Lastly, I just want to say on the UC system is that, they publish these requirements, but the reality is like, if you think you're going to get into Berkeley or UCLA with 3 levels of math, 2 levels of science, 2 levels of language, like that just is not going to happen. You need to assume that in history, English, mathematics, science, language, you really need to be 4 or 5 years. And that means summer school, that means taking online courses, like if you look at the kids who are actually getting accepted, it's not kids who have completed 2 years of science. It's not kids who have completed 2 years of language. So you have to take sort of the, A through G requirement as a guideline, but the admissions expectation is much higher. And I think that's something that gets lost on people oftentimes. I also do want to point out that while the UC system is test blind, meaning that they don't allow you to submit your SAT or ACT scores currently, they still allow you to submit external exams like the APs and the IB exams. And that's very meaningful. So, there is a little bit more pressure now around AP testing, IB testing, et cetera. So, if your son or daughter is preparing for an AP exam this year, that's very relevant if they're hoping to be a competitive applicant at the UC. So, listen, thanks so much for your time. I always enjoy the opportunity to kind of share what we're learning in a broader fashion. And hopefully this was helpful. Listen, I think what I would take away from this, sort of in general is as follows. One, around SAT and ACT, if you can take the exam and you're able to get a good score, it is more beneficial to submit a test score than to not submit a test score. Two, if a student is qualified, applying early decision is probably the single greatest strategy that will move the needle. And third, applying to a wide breadth of schools now is probably the norm. And so, having a very tight list of very selective schools it is almost a recipe for disaster. And so, it's okay to go for it. And it's okay to have competitive schools on a list for students who are competitive and who are qualified. But you have to sort of mitigate the risk across the entire list and across all scenarios. So again, thanks so much for joining us. And hopefully today was helpful. We'll follow up with a recording of the webinar as well as the deck. And if you have any questions, you can always feel free to email me or anyone on the team. Thanks so much to everybody, and we'll see you again really soon.